Welcome, everyone, to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Durling, and I am very pleased to welcome my guest on this episode. He's a musician, he's a writer, and like a lot of us, he's a Kiss fan. Uh, Mr. Joey Cassata, how are you doing, sir?
How are you, brother? So great to see you. Thanks so much for having me today.
Really appreciate you coming on here. Pleasure's mine, and I know a lot of people have been excited about this. Joey, for those that don't know, we're here to talk about your latest book, but bring us up to speed. Like, what's your history with, how did you get to this point?
So, lifelong musician, been playing drums since I'm 5 years old. Saw Kiss at Madison Square Garden, 1979. A 5 year old little chubby kid walking into Madison Square Garden, didn't know what to expect. Came out a changed man. When I heard those bombs and the loud music, and I saw those superheroes on stage, my life was changed forever. So that Christmas, asked for a drum set, started plugging away on that. Struggled for years trying to get good and playing in crappy bands and building local fan bases and then trying to get record deals. And then the 90s hit, and I was into more of the hair metal bands and Skid Row and Bon Jovi and all that stuff. And the 90s came and kind of crushed everything for me, and I kind of never gave up on my dreams, still pursued it, started, doing some other bands and some alternative bands, and, just stuck with it. And, finally, right after that wave of grunge hit, um, my original band ZO2, we formed in around 2002, and we made our debut record Tuesdays and Thursdays. Independent label, we couldn't get a record deal to save our lives. Independent label, just ourselves basically funding the record. Got it into the right hands. Paul Stanley from Kiss heard the record, almost like a full circle moment. Kiss invited us, one of the only unsigned bands really to ever do a full tour with Kiss. We toured with Kiss 2004, Rock the Nation tour. And then from there, really the career has been skyrocketing ever since.
Cool. It sounds like a couple of things. It sounds like we're about the same age because I was born in 74, and I
Perfect. Yep,
too
me too.
was not a fan of the music of the 90s. I was still hanging on to Skid Row and Winger, and the difference is I haven't opened for Kiss. That's very
Yeah,
cool.
but you know what? All of us, I think we had to kind of, weather the storm through the 90s. A lot of us, even those bands that we loved, they couldn't, sell a carton of milk if they were selling milk
Oh,
to a farm. You know what I
brutal.
mean? They could not do anything to save their lives. So all of us, the fans and the musicians at that time period, just kind of weathered that storm, and then everything came back around.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got a lot of younger people I've talked to that so for some reason watch my show and are interested in 70s, 80s classic rock. And I try to explain, I lived through that. It was tough. I mean, if you were, you were almost judged for the contents of your record collection. If you were in 94 and you dared to say, yeah, I like Dokken, you know,
It was like a curse. Yeah.
but now, it's all kind of classic rock, right? So I saw you posting about your latest book, which we'll get to in a second, and I thought, okay, this is the book that I've been wanting to read, and so we're gonna go back. You say you saw Kiss in 1979.
I did on the Dynasty tour.
Okay, so were you into Kiss at this point actively? I mean, I know you were just a kid back then, but just a boy.
No, so very nicely done. So no, I didn't even know who Kiss was. I had an older brother. Mom was taking my older brother to go see Kiss at the Garden. He's 5 years older than me, so he was heavily into Kiss at that time. I did not even know who they were. I think I remember maybe seeing a commercial for them, and I think I was even scared at the time of who Kiss was. And but even when I was going to that show, it almost did. I didn't put two and two together. I didn't even know why we were going. It was my first big event. Never went to the circus or a sporting event up until that point. This was my first arena, and wasn't a fan. Walked out again, like I said, changed fan for life.
So I have to wonder, rewinding, timeline is everything. I didn't get into Kiss until much later. I was a late bloomer to them, but I'm
What year?
wondering, do you happen to recall when this came out, or
Oh,
was this one that was you discovered later?
no. So again, that's why, I've always been such a big fan of The Elder. The Elder was actually the first record I ever bought with my own money. So
Wow.
it was 1981. I went to my local mall. Now I had some of my brother's records up at this point. I think I had Double Platinum. I had Love Gun. I think I had Dynasty, and went to the local Sam Goody in my area in the mall, shifting through the Kiss records, and I saw on the new release wall that album that you just held up with the plain brown door with a hand and a knocker, and it had the little Kiss logo in the corner. And believe it or not, I was skeptical, and I was probably 7, almost going on 8 now, but I grew up in Brooklyn, and my grandparents lived in the West Village in Manhattan. So I had a lot of bootleg shops in the West Village that I would go to with my brother, and we would get some like live bootleg records and stuff like that, and they always sounded like crap. And I was worried, believe it or not, that Kiss record, The Elder, was a bootleg, because I'm flipping it over, turning it sideways, turning it every way. There's no picture of Kiss. So
Yep.
I wasn't sure, even though that Kiss logo was there, I was not sure it was a Kiss record, but I was determined. I had my Walkman, that almost like the headphones, the old school Walkman. And I said, you know what? Let me buy the cassette. That way, I'll pop it in my Walkman as soon as we walk out. If it sounds like crap, I'll go in and try to return it. Flipped it on. The Oath came on. That was the original first track of that
Yep. Yep.
record. I was not only hooked by that, but I took a quick peek at the liner notes, and it said Kisses, Ace Frehley, Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, and Eric Carr. And it blew my mind a little bit because, again, I was a Peter fan up until this point, didn't know who this mysterious Eric Carr was. And, for the next year and a half, 2 years, I was on a mission to see what Eric Carr looked like.
That is so cool there's so many things about that story that's cool, Joey. One thing's I think you're the first person I've talked to that their first album by anybody was The Elder.
Crazy.
My Elder story, it goes, so I honest to God, I didn't get into Kiss until 93. I had a good friend of mine get me into Kiss. I don't know. I missed the boat on them, and I didn't know anybody else that liked them. I got, the band that turned me around to hard rock music was Bon Jovi when Slippery When Wet came out in '86. I was 12. I was target audience, right? Def Leppard were huge for me, and I still love that old stuff. Um, but Kiss, when I finally decided to get into Kiss, it was repeated playings of Alive 3 because I'm like, you know what? This has all like a lot of the Kiss songs I like in one place. And I knew I couldn't just get one or two, but one thing that was appealing to me about getting into Kiss, you're getting this huge back catalog to explore. And I knew that there was this album called The Elder or something or other about the Elder that the band didn't like to talk about. Nobody seemed to ever talk about it. Well, that made me want to learn more about it. So I was always very intrigued. And yeah, I'm one of those guys. I'm one of those, Paul Stanley said we should be committed. That likes this album. Now, I say that and I always have to follow it up by saying if I were an active Kiss fan in 1981 and that was the new album that came out, I don't know if I'd have been so excited about it.
Right.
But when you go back and listen, I admire the fact that it took a lot of guts to do such a left turn album at that point in their career. At that point in their career, I don't think it would have made much difference. Kiss needed to, they were in a valley and they needed to wait for that peak again, which we all know it came. But yeah, especially the track listing that maybe doesn't follow the story, but opening with the Oath is a smart move because how can you resist that guitar riff?
Yeah, listen, couldn't agree more. Again, the thing about The Elder that's appealing to me, and being a Kiss fan from a little bit earlier in the years. And I understood why you weren't a Kiss fan until the 90s. If you started getting into music around those mid 80s, Kiss was not the cool band. It was Bon Jovi, it was Def Leppard, it was, Poison and, Cinderella and all these, hair metal bands that were coming up. Kiss was kind of like they're the older guys that kind of still do this too. Kiss wasn't the cool band. So I get it. So if you weren't a Kiss fan before that, I get that it took you a little while to get into that. But for me, the greatest thing about Kiss, and it still holds true after all these years, those first, I don't know, I might even be more of an 80s Kiss fan than a 70s Kiss fan, but it's back and forth. But no one can deny those first six records by Kiss were magical,
Yeah.
perfect records. But I also, in my brain, I don't want 30 of those. I don't want, even though as much as I love Love Gun and Rock and Roll Over and Dress to Kill and Destroyer, I don't want those records over and over and over and over again, like AC/DC or some of these bands, which I respect from them what they did. But what I love about Kiss, I love having those, all the Haagen-Dazs flavors. I want their 32 flavors in Kiss. I want the Kiss flavors are so eclectic, and you can go from The Elder, and then you can go to Creatures of the Night and Carnival of Souls, and then put on Bubblegum Unmasked and Crazy Nights, and then go to Hotter Than Hell. And there's so much different music in the Kiss catalog.
They don't
That to
get
me is it's what makes Kiss special.
they don't get enough credit for how versatile they were, really, from album to album. Um, and you are right. Kiss was not a cool band in the mid '80s. They just weren't. And the interviews, it's like they always came off like they were the coolest band in the world. And that just kind of like, I don't get it. I don't get it. I wasn't really hearing the right songs. Um, as much as I love stuff like Tears Are Falling and Crazy Crazy Nights. I don't know. It just took me longer, but I definitely made up for it. I became a Kiss nut. And the cool thing is that I did get into them when I did a highly unlikely time. So I wasn't jumping on the bandwagon when they reunited in '96, and I saw that tour in Montreal, and that was fantastic. But uh, the other thing about that is that all of a sudden it's like none of the non-makeup stuff existed for a while. There was a real thick line drawn, it seemed. But back to the Elder, I remember listening to this, and my good friend Matt and I, who Matt's the guy that got me into uh, Kiss in a big way. He and another buddy of mine, but he had the record. None of us had. That was the only thing, the only version of the Elder we had. This is '93. It's internet is in its absolute infancy, so you couldn't just go and listen to stuff.
Sure.
I remember we'd listen to that record and try and write out what we thought the lyrics were, and
Wow.
it was just something about it that was just so absolutely different. And you're right, that cover, you've got the most visual band in the world, and plus the first time in their career that there's been a lineup change. I mean, we all know Peter's not on Unmasked, but he was pictured as being on Unmasked,
Right.
and there's not one picture of the band anywhere on the Elder. Um, there's just a real,
I
there's
think it
just
was
a
a hit.
real
I think
air
it
of
was a hit.
mystery around
Yeah,
it.
it was a hiccup too. I think, listen, as much as Kiss was dead, 1981, Kiss was dead in America. So it didn't matter if they released Creatures then or Lick It Up, whatever record came out then, it was going to be a flat record because Kiss was just flat at that time. They weren't cool again in 81. So, but I do think that Kiss missed the boat with this big concept record that they were putting out. And it had this basic storyline that Gene came up with, which is inside the cover, and we'll get into that once we get into the book. But I think they missed the boat because anyone, and you're the same age as me, and if you remember correctly, 81, 82, 83, you're talking Dungeons and Dragons is very, very big. Conan the Barbarian, Clash of the Titans, Dragon Slayer, all these movies and based around sword and sorcery, and that's what The Elder is. And
Yep.
I think they completely missed that boat. I think they tried to capture the Bob Ezrin wall. Pink Floyd's The Wall. The cover is literally a white wall, right? The bricks.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
and I think they tried to capture that feel, but they just completely missed the mark. Whereas if the cover of The Elder, and I know I'm probably going way maybe too far left, but if the cover of The Elder is dragons and fire and castles and swords with Kiss in the new getup with Eric Carr on the cover, I think immediately, no matter what, the record does better.
That I've never thought about that before, but you are absolutely correct. I mean, it's a familiar, um, the tropes, if you like, in the story are kind of like, it's Star Wars or it's
Of
Lord of the
course,
Rings. It's like the young boy, the chosen one. He doesn't want to do it, but circumstances force him to. It's and it
it's the
works. It works
age
because
old story. Yep.
it's a well worn. But you're right. I mean, they could have spun it into a video, early video game at the time. Um, yeah, that cover should have looked more like a Molly Hatchet album cover or an Ingve album cover. You know what I mean?
Ingve trilogy, the Ingve trilogy
Yes,
album cover,
exactly.
something like that.
Yep.
Yes, you hit it right on the nose. Yep.
Yeah. So, and as most diehard fans know, the idea is that music from the Elder, the reason it was called music from the Elder, was that it was the soundtrack to a movie that was sure to come out. So they were really putting the cart before the horse. I love that gatefold.
Me
Um,
too.
but of course, it never did. The album was a stiff. To this day, I have to think if Universal did an audit at this day, I have to think it must be close to gold, or if it's not, for
It's
just
gotta
just people
be.
like us buying it on CD and then buying the remastered CD and then buying the vinyl when it came out.
In general, I'm not sure why Kiss is not trying to recertify all their records. They're very, award driven type of band. They're always quoting how many albums they sold or how many gold records they have or biggest tour of the year. What they love those stats. And I'm surprised that Kiss of all bands didn't go back and recertify
Me
all
too.
of
Yeah,
these
it's a
records because
weird because they always talk about Alive being such a big seller, and if you go on RIAA.com, it's still just at gold.
yeah,
If you were to believe the hard numbers on RIAA, the biggest selling Kiss albums are Alive 2 and Smashes, Thrashes, and Hits, which makes
right.
no sense.
There's no way albums like Alive One are not platinum or
Yeah.
not
There's no way
diamond now.
Destroyer
They're
isn't double
diamond.
platinum at
I
least.
think
Like
they're diamond.
Dynasty.
I think they're all diamond. I think they're all 10 million sellers by now. Not all of them. I think the big ones, Alive 1, Alive 2, Destroyer, maybe Dynasty. I think these albums have a shot at all being diamond records, which are 10 million records.
Yeah, definitely more than like sitting at gold status. But
Yeah,
so as we know, the Elder, it didn't in its initial run was not successful. By today's standards, I think it was very successful, but it
sure.
wasn't, and it wasn't based on the what Kiss had done in the past. And the band just kind of disowned it in a way. With once Creatures of the Night came out, which Creatures of the Night and Dynasty they're always vying for my favorite Kiss albums, as different as they are. I love that whole time period. Actually,
Yeah,
between
me
like
too.
79 83, I love that whole I'm fascinated by it because there's so much happened in such a short amount of time.
The word you said was perfect. Fascinated by it because it's such a mysterious time in the Kiss world because they weren't the biggest band anymore. And they put out these very different records between Dynasty Unmasked, Elder and Creatures, and even Killers inside there too.
Yep.
With the lineup change, the new makeup, Vinny coming in with the new makeup, a lot of stuff was going on, and the press in general, magazines didn't care about Kiss. So not only is it a very mysterious time because they didn't get a lot of press coverage, but I just think it's a fascinating time period in their history because they were going through so many changes. The music really is exceptional, but it's so different than anywhere else in the Kiss catalog all those
Yeah.
years, those 3 years.
And I mean, they're making press appearances with Ace,
Yeah.
even though is he in the band? Is he out of the? Yeah, it's just really weird. So here sits the Elder. They take the makeup off. They got a big buzz with Lick It Up. Uh, Animalize is a big album. I mean, they're continuing. They're at least going gold through the rest of the '80s.
Yeah.
The Hot in the Shade comes out, top 10 single with Forever. They put out a really highly acclaimed, heavier album with Revenge than they. So in all that time, and really it's never changed. They were always, Paul especially, very, very dismissive of the Elder. And if I think I've got this right, when the CDs first came out, I don't even think that the Elder was part of that original run. I don't think it was looked like 89
So
until
wow, I don't remember that. Could be. You're right.
I don't think that it's like they didn't even want to admit that it existed, but eventually it came out. So of course, anything like that, it's just dying for a cult following. And the Elder has a cult following, even in amongst Kiss fans. It's you say the Elder, and either people, run away, or they're like, "Wait, what would you say the Elders? Let's talk about the Elder." And what was it that eventually led you to this excellent, excellent book, The Order of the Rose? I mean, look at that cover, folks. That is so
Yeah,
cool.
it's definitely something more would have sold better, I think, for the record cover, right? It just it pops a little more. It's something what I always envisioned what it could have been. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's what
But
your idea was like. This was,
yeah, I mean, it could have been. Just it felt a little bit more of that fantasy realm. I mean, obviously that cover is very based on my story, which is just inspired by the Elder. I just want to make sure everyone knows that. But the origin of why I wound up writing this book. So it really started back in October. Myself, Todd Kearns, who is from Bruce's band, Zach
yeah,
Throne, who's also from Bruce's band, Jeremy Osbrock from Ace's band, and Tyson Leslie, who plays with Vixen. We were approached by promoter Neil Davis, who was putting on Kiss Cancer Goodbye, to do The Elder in its entirety live. And we were like, oh my God, I don't know if we can pull this off. This is going to be, this is not like just, the year before I did the Full Alive 3 record, your favorite record,
yeah,
with Bruce, cover to cover. I did it
awesome.
with Bruce. I did it with Todd. It was a pleasure. But
But this is, yeah,
learning,
the Elder is not guitar, bass, and drums.
right, learning Alive 3 was, I don't want to call it a breeze, but it was a breeze compared to learning the Elder, not only because like you said, there's layering of music on the Elder, but Alive 3 is a live record. I'm getting the ins, I'm getting the how to end the songs. It's pretty, you learn that record, you can play it live.
It's
You're just
almost like a
listening.
recital, right?
Right, exactly right. You're just learning it note for note that's there. With the Elder, when we started to dive into this, we all made a pact. We said, listen, if the five of us are going to do this, and I couldn't have done it with any better group of guys. These guys are like world class musicians, singers, harmonists. The way they play their instruments are incredible. So when we approached this record, we knew we were going to try to get it as perfect as humanly possible. And to do that, it was really mostly about not learning parts, but actually figuring out what the hell they were doing on this record. Because there's
Right.
some spots on this record that I got to tell you, after diving into it, I think it's edited by Bob Ezrin, where there's an odd time bar here that I just don't see Kiss writing. That maybe he just cut cut the tape, edited out a bar, and they went 7.5 measures instead of the full 8 measures. And it was just wonky editing. So we had to learn all the ins and outs of not only the songs, but the way it was edited to try to recreate it for the people who are fans of the record that know what the record sounds like. So we
Yeah.
can't just interpret it our way because, I would try to play it my way and Jeremy would play it his way and blah, blah, blah. So we went, we really dove so deep into this record. I got such a new appreciation for the record. I always loved the record, but now that I'm diving into it, I'm almost listening to it with the other side of my brain. I always listened to it as a fan and as just a enjoyment factor. Now I'm listening to it more as I don't want to call it like a mathematician would, try to work out
You're
and solve
analyzing.
problems. I'm analyzing the record, the lyrics, the changes, the orchestration, the feeling, the emotions. And I really started to get into it even more. So as I was learning it back in October, I just started writing down some ideas of what I thought this story could be fleshed out into. Obviously, Gene wrote the basic hero, prophecy story, like you said. It's Star Wars, it's Lord of the Rings, it's Jesus in a way. There's so many different
Oh
stories
yeah, it's like it's
across
historical.
history.
Like this is, it's your, the reluctant hero.
The reluctant hero called upon by greater powers to save everyone from the evil, right? It's a very black and white story, right? And, I started to expand on it a little bit, and I'm a big fantasy reader. I'm a big comic book reader. You know, right after with ZO2, I was acting for a while on our show called Z Rock on IFC. So I got into writing more, writing scripts. And so, all my worlds started to kind of collide as I was starting to write this story. And I just started basically writing an outline, never thinking that I was really even going to do it. It's just almost for my own enjoyment, like, well, I wonder what this could have been. Fast forward, we do the performance, and the performance was a mega hit. It came off without any, big blowups or anything. We had one rehearsal to get through the full Elder. We played it the next day, and on social media, we've gotten over 1 million views on our performance. It's on social media right now. You can check it out at Kiss Cancer Goodbye on YouTube, or you can go to Joey Cassata at YouTube. You can see the whole entire Elder performance, cover to cover, front to back, the original track listing, starting with Fanfare and going to Just a Boy and
So you
so on.
okay,
And
so you did an order of the story.
we did the story order.
How
Exactly
did you do
right.
stuff like Odyssey?
Again, so we had keyboards, he layered some stuff, but it's a little bit heavier than it is on the record, but it just worked. Todd's voice was incredible. Like I said, the orchestration stuff, even though it's not in there with the layering, it still captures the essence of the Elder. Believe it or not, the Odyssey was one of my least favorite songs on the record, and now it's one of my favorite because the way we played it live. So anyway,
Awesome.
we got such a big response. Like I said, over 1 million views across social media, YouTube, everything, which is ironically more views than the record sold, which is
Well,
funny.
I was just thinking that like that just shows you people are fascinated by this record.
Hence exactly why I pursued the next step of my writing. So I said, wow, I didn't realize how many people really still love this record. Let me try to write this story. And like I said, it's inspired by the record. It's inspired by the lyrics. It's inspired by the storyline and the music. There's no technical reference to Kiss. There's no Gene, Paul, Peter, Ace, Eric in the storyline. But as you know, you read the story. There's variations of those characters.
Exactly.
There's
Yes,
there's
there's
offshoots.
variants of the names, and at a certain point, it almost becomes a lot of fun where it's like you're looking for Kiss references outside of the Elder, and I'm not going to spoil it at all, but there's you're drawing upon what was right around this album a lot, and it works.
I tried to not only write the story of what the Elder could have been, but I utilized Kiss lore, the history of Kiss, the personalities of these characters, the personalities of these people. I read all their autobiographies. So a lot of these characters in the story are based on real Kiss characters, as we know. There's Ferric the Fox, Eric, based heavily on Eric Carr. Obviously, Eric Carr is the Fox. Ferric, I knew I wanted to make one of the main characters in this story. So I started writing the story, and it flowed out of me so quickly. Like I said, I really started actually writing this book late December,
So
and it
this
was
came
it
together quickly,
very
relative.
quickly. Yep. Like I said, the basic outline was done around October, and then I didn't start writing dialogue and characters and all that stuff until late December. So it came together really quick once I started doing it.
And without getting into it, because folks, if you think you want this book, you do, and I don't want to spoil it. But I love the fact that you aren't just talking about Kiss as they existed on The Elder. You're using like there's characters that come in that you might not think would get mentioned in an Elder inspired story. And I laughed to when I first read about who one of the big bads was and his name. It that I got a good chuckle out of that, and it works. If you know your Kiss history, it's like an amplified version of stories that we all have heard about certain players.
Yeah, and again, me being the Kiss nerd that I am, the reason why the story came together so quick was because I had so much inspiration to draw from. All of these characters that I wrote about are all inspired, like you said, by people in the Kiss world, whether they're Kiss members, Kiss managers, Kiss this Kiss, they're all inspired by all people we know from the Kiss world, Ghost players, whatever we're talking about. So all their personalities, if you're a big Kiss fan, the drama that went on in the Kiss camp. Who was hard to work with, who was easy to work with, whose personality was strong, who was a little bit more meek and laid back, who was quiet, who was overwhelming, who was self-deprecating, who was maybe some kind of addict of some kind, who was, kind of a little full of themselves. So I kind of used all of that stuff to build the characters of this world in a way that I tried to make it very Kiss friendly. If you're a Kiss fan, I would hope you're going to get 95% of the references that I make in the book. But I also try to make it where is if you do not even have you've never heard of The Elder and you've never heard of Kiss, I would think this is still a really captivating fantasy
Oh,
novel.
it stands. Yeah, you need have any interest in Kiss if you just like a good fantasy read. Yeah, you've done like yes, absolutely. It stands on its own. But if you are a huge Kiss fan, it's just icing on the cake just to find all of those references. And I have to say, I think Ferric is one of my favorite characters in the book, and I think that's by design
Absolutely.
because Eric Carr was such a well-loved member of Kiss. He wasn't an original, so he always kind of had that, and you work that into the story really, really well. Um, but yeah, it does. There's a lot to do with the council, the Order of the Rose, and sacrificing, and it's all there. But again, you need never have heard a note of any Kiss song, although I can't see how it's possible you've never heard any Kiss song. But you don't need to be this diehard fan of this obscure album that a branch of the Kiss fans are nuts about, like we are. It stands on its own, but it's just a good combination of you can enjoy it for the Kiss references and the story, or you can just enjoy it for the story.
Yeah, I really do think there's three layers to it. I think, listen, if you're an Uber Kiss fan like we are, and an Uber Elder fan like we are, you're probably going to get the most out of it, right? Because you're not only going to get all the Kiss references and you're going to enjoy the fantasy story of it, but you're also going to get all the Elder stuff that you've been dying to know about. What could the Council of the Elder really have been like, and were they good, were they bad, and what powers did they have, and so on and so forth. But I also think there's that middle line, whereas if you're just a really big Kiss fan, but you don't like The Elder, I still think there's so much to enjoy in this book because it's still a Kiss book at heart. Because like you said, all these characters are drawn from the history of Kiss, not just The Elder. The
No,
the the strong core of it is The Elder, of course, but it's drawn on the history of Kiss from the beginning all the way up to now. And, it says it right on the back of the book. The avatars have a big part to play in this book. And obviously, we know where Kiss is going into the future with the avatars. And that's kind of where I base those characters off of. I base the avatars on what Kiss is kind of going into now. Now, we don't even know what that is. So I'm drawing on just a name and I'm using that name to kind of call these characters a group of people. But I think, having it touch all bases from all the way to the avatars to the very beginnings of Kiss, it's a really great Kiss book, I would hope, even if you really don't like The Elder.
yeah, I think so. I mean, for one thing, if you don't like the music on the Elder, you don't have to listen. It's not like you have to listen while you're, it's not a read along read along with the Elder type of book. I want to get back to the tribute concert for a second, Joey. What was the hardest song to learn? And was there a song that you thought was going to be really hard and turned out to be not so bad, easier than you thought?
Yeah, so the two trickiest songs for me as a drummer, and there's no reason why. It's not something that in the song was very difficult to play or patterns or something, but Only You was tricky. There's a lot of weird entrances for fills and measures and just choices that Eric Carr made in that song that are just very different, and they're very theatrical the way they're approaching the music in this record. You know, I have a theater background too. I did Broadway for years, for 5 years. I was on Broadway, and that helped me kind of get into that brain. I had to kind of go into my theater brain for a little bit and figure out some of these arrangement that Ezrin was coming up with to pick out things in like the Odyssey and Only You. But the two that gave me the most headaches were Only You and, believe it or not, Mr. Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell, all those stops, all those little intricate stuff that
There
Eric's
are a
doing
lot,
in
yeah, there are
there,
a lot of stops. There's a da-dun, da-dun, da. There's a lot of that.
and they're all different for no
Yeah.
reason. For no reason, you know, the same part in section one is the same playing part in section two, but the arrangement of it's different. So it just gave me challenges. And then I think, you know, a couple of songs that I thought were going to be, you know, I had never played almost anything on the Elder except maybe I played a couple times. You know, I thought something like The Oath because that's the bombastic drum song. But The Oath I found more just straightforward rock. You know, we did Creatures the same weekend. We actually did The Elder and Creatures the same weekend. So diving into Creatures was more like diving into The Oath. So The
The
Oath with the
Oath
double,
and Creatures of the Night, the song, are really kind of similar.
agreed. And again, the playing is difficult. It's physically difficult, you know, the double bass drumming and all that stuff, but it didn't give me problems like some of those other intricate songs did.
Yeah. Cool. That's so cool. Yeah, I'll post a link to that performance under this because I know people are going to want to, if they haven't
Awesome.
seen it already, I know they're going to see that. So, The Order of the Rose, highly inspired by the Elder, but not necessarily, you know, it's not the lyrics from the album just fleshed out a little bit. This is a full story unto its own, but you do kind of you can picture in your head where, you know, if this were, you mentioned Broadway, if this was made into a play, well, you can picture where the songs would be playing because they're, you know, when they deal with certain things. Um, and it yeah, I was very, very entertained by it. And so folks, I'll have a link to that too below, but you know,
And
uh
listen, there is, you know, obviously the book, it's available in hardcover and softcover on Amazon, but there is an audiobook. And I know, listen, there's a lot of Kiss fans out there that probably don't have the stamina or just the want to sit down and read a 350-page fantasy novel inspired by the Elder. And I get it. So, you know, I made sure that I did an accompanying audiobook. And for the audiobook, I was graced with, there's a band called Ancient Door, and I'm not sure if you've heard of them or not, but Ancient Door recreated the full Elder album.
I was
They
gonna say just the name of the band makes me think
Yep.
Ancient
They
Door.
they modernized the Elder. It's a little bit more modern sounding. It's a little bit heavier, some more orchestration. It's even fleshed out a little bit more with some interlude stuff. And it's a great, great record. It's on Spotify. Check out Ancient Door. They were gracious enough to let me use clips of their songs for the audiobook. So the
Cool.
audiobook, it's, you know, I got a really great narrator. I was going to read it at first, and I read my autobiography when it first came out. And I, you know, obviously I talk like Joey from Brooklyn. Hey, yo, how you doing? But you know, I couldn't read. I tried reading this book for the audiobook and it just didn't feel right. I needed some kind of magic in the voice and I just didn't have it. And, you know, I got this great narrator to do it, and it's a really cool, dark, deep voice that narrates the Elder. And I sprinkle in, like you said, where these songs maybe could be placed in a movie, in a play, in a production of some sort. And you'll see as you're listening to the Elder story from Order of the Rose on the audiobook, there are clips, tiny clips only, just to get you back into the world where the record could have been.
Awesome. Yeah, like this is the, you know, it's one of those things like when Tim McFate and Julian Gill put out Odyssey, a book about the Elder, I couldn't get that fast enough. So like it's just I as many times, I mean, we all love Alive, we all love Destroyer. I think I know the stories behind those. I want to know about the, you know, I want more on the albums that nobody ever talks about. Um, So what so that brings us up to the present. What are you up to now? Where can people find you? What are your latest projects, and have you got any more book ideas in mind?
I've already started on the next book. I don't want to give it away, but it is Kiss inspired. It's inspired by a very the other, I won't give it away. You'll know what I'm talking about right away. The other very culty following in the Kiss world. So there's the elder that Kiss hates, but there's a cult following. There's something else that Kiss hates, but there's also a cult following. So I started to do something with that. But again, this is, you're talking way in the future. I just started fleshing some stuff out. But you could obviously buy the Order of the Rose. It's available on Amazon. It's on hardcover, it's on soft cover, it's on audiobook, on Audible, on Apple Audiobooks, I think it's called. I forget what it's called exactly, but you'll find it. Just type in Joey Cassata on Amazon and you'll see all that stuff pop up. And of course, I'm on social media across all platforms at Joey Cassata, and all the stuff we talked about, like ZO2, my first band, and stuff with the performance of the Elder or performance of Creatures of the Night, all on my YouTube page. It's kind of all one-stop shopping.
Well, it's always cool to talk to a fellow Kiss fan. It's always cool to talk to a fellow Kiss fan of this particular era. So, Joey, I want to thank you for coming on here and talking about this, and congratulations on a really, really great fantasy book, and I think a fitting tribute. Now, I have to ask. Everybody asks this when if I do a book about a band. Do you know if Paul and Gene, for example, are aware of this book?
I don't. I have no idea. Nor even if they were aware, would I think they care about it. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they would love it, if they would hate it, if they would be mad at me for doing it. I'm not really sure. Again, I didn't touch on any copywritten material. I made sure
No,
that,
I was
yep, I
gonna,
wanted,
that's another
yep.
thing. You did that very, just
It,
up to the precipice, but there's nothing that anybody can, hey, well, I guess you didn't.
Yep, it's a fine line because it's obviously the story is the story. It's a broad story, but couldn't use Gene Simmons, couldn't use Ace Frehley, couldn't use Kiss. I didn't want to infringe on any copyrights, so I made sure that it was a story of my own, just inspired by the Elder. So I'm not sure if they heard it or read it or heard about it. I'd love to know what their take. God, I wish they one of them. Gene maybe would be the only one that would take the
I can
time
see
to
Gene
possibly reading
nodding,
it.
nodding his head in approval, at least privately.
Because I think he's someone like me, loves fantasy, loves horror movies, and loves comic books. So I think Gene would appreciate something like
I
this.
think he would look at it and go, "This is what I had in mind."
Yeah,
Yeah.
I hope
So there,
so.
so there you go, folks. Order the Rose. Go get it. I'll have the link posted below and some other cool stuff that Joey's done. Joey, thanks a lot for doing this.
Thank you so much, my brother. Thanks for having me again. Thanks for everyone. If you go out and buy the book, make sure you leave me a review on Amazon. I love, even when you read the book, I love hearing back and forth. Just tell me what you're thinking along the way. I want to see what Kiss Easter eggs you find.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for watching this edition of Tim's Final Confessions. Go listen to The Elder if you haven't listened to it in a while, and go get Joey's book.